everyone, and welcome to today's video. I'm joined by Susie Sentence. Susie, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, my name's Susie. I run a company called Oxford BSL and I offer hearing loss inclusion services for businesses.
Thank you. And as you know, my name is Roy Magara. I'm an employment solicitor at Magara Law. We act for both employers and employees across a whole breadth of employment law issues. In this video, we're going to be talking about deaf awareness. And Susie, it's a really interesting topic, actually. And having had my conversation with you, I'm just blown away by so many stats that I simply did not have any idea about. And so in this particular video, we're going to be talking about the sorts of things that employers can do to ensure that they make their workplaces improve on this particular subject. Let's dive in, shall we? What exactly does it mean to be deaf?
Well, so people think that the word deaf, it just means people who are profoundly deaf. So those people who use sign language, who, they think, oh, I don't know anybody who's deaf. But actually, it's kind of a catch-all word. So it covers the entire breadth of any kind of hearing loss or hearing conditions like tinnitus, for example. So you could have somebody who kind of comes under the blanket of deaf when we're talking about deaf awareness, but they might only have a mild loss and perhaps not even wear any hearing technology. So it covers the whole breadth of the hearing spectrum, as it were.
That again is one of the things that I don't know, I think I'm slightly ashamed to say I didn't necessarily appreciate. And I think many people just consider being deaf as some sort of hearing loss full stop. I can't hear anything or I can partially not hear anything. But you've highlighted, for example, tinnitus, and I appreciate that has a range in and of itself. Maybe speak to that, please, in terms of some of the kind of myth busting that you often do in your role.
So somebody who is deaf, as I say, doesn't necessarily mean that they have no hearing. So there's this range of hearing. It doesn't mean that somebody has had that hearing loss from birth. They might have had it at any stage in their life. And I think it's really, really important for people to remember that hearing loss is not just something that happens to old people. Hearing loss can occur at any age, and there is still this stigma, I think, around hearing loss. People who perhaps my age, so I first started having a hearing loss around the age of about 32, 33, and people see it as an old person kind of condition. They're like, oh, my grandparents have hearing aids or whatever. So it's important to remember that anybody can have hearing loss at any age and that they need to be treated equally with their hearing colleagues.
I hear you. Let's speak to some stats. I love a good stat. Talk me through some of the most common stats that in your role you teach people about, you bring awareness to on this particular subject.
So the most recent stats that we've got are based on a survey that was done last year in 2024 by the RNID, the Royal National Institute for the Deaf, and their survey found that on this range of deafness, so when I talk about deafness, I'm talking about that entire range and including tinnitus and things like that. So the number of adults in the UK who have some level of hearing loss or hearing condition, the number is 18 million, which is just about a quarter. So 1 in 4 people, adults in this country, have some kind of hearing loss or hearing condition, which makes it the second most common disability in the country.
Isn't that incredible?
And people always say, I don't know anybody who's deaf, and it's like, so so that's the really big one that came out. There are other ones from the survey. For example, 67% of the people who were surveyed said that they had suffered negative attitudes and behaviours from the general public, specifically relating to their hearing loss. And that just speaks about a lack of awareness and understanding on how to communicate with people, But as I say, if it's 1 in 4 people have some level of hearing loss, then why aren't we being more deaf aware? Why aren't people having more understanding and having this knowledge, having training, and showing that in their lives? We work so hard to make things perhaps accessible for some other disabilities. So wheelchairs, people, we want to make sure, which is absolutely the right thing to do, but we want to make sure that things are accessible for people who perhaps have mobility issues, or perhaps use a wheelchair. So now we need to start making things more accessible for people with other disabilities. And as hearing loss is the second most common disability in the country, it makes sense that it's perhaps the next focus that we have. So 2/3 of people suffering negative behaviours based on a lack of deaf awareness and knowledge and understanding in the general public. And then at work, 1/4 of people who were surveyed said that they'd experienced negative attitudes and behaviours from their colleagues, which again just speaks about that lack of training, which is something that employers can absolutely work on and offer.
Quite right. 18 million people in the UK, I think you mentioned, 1/4 of employees signaling that they're having issues at work. That's 25%. These numbers are huge. They're really huge. And you've rightly helped us form a bridge now in terms of the sorts of things that employers can do for and with their deaf employees to ensure that they see their workplaces thrive and their employees thrive. So one of the things that certainly from my end, as it were, as an employment lawyer, that we're often talking to employers about and advising employees on, often when things go wrong, unfortunately, is this concept of reasonable adjustments. And as some people will know, reasonable adjustments are the sorts of things that employers ought to be doing for their employees who are disabled to ensure that they are on an equal footing, as it were, as the rest of their other employees who may not necessarily have that same disability, as it were. Now, there are so many variables and factors that you've got to consider. You've got to consider the size of the organization, the resources that organization has, the financial contributions it can make, depending on what those reasonable adjustments are. But before we get into the reasonable adjustments, I'll just touch on exactly what a disability is. Legally speaking, in sort of basic terms, a disability is any condition that can substantially adversely affect someone's ability to carry out their normal day-to-day activities. And that particular condition's got to last for up to at least 12 months or more. And I dare say, when we're talking about the subject of deafness or being deaf, I would say that in the most part, that's going to fall indeed under the Equality Act and the relevant legislation and be seen as a disability. So when an employee does disclose their disability or being deaf to an employer, then the employer has a duty to make what we call reasonable adjustments. And that's got to be a two-way conversation. Often we have employee clients who come along and say, well, I didn't tell my employer, but they should have just been able to tell. Well, your employer's got to know what's going on with you first before they're able to make any sort of action. You as the employee can't just simply leave it to an employer to guess and think, oh, this person didn't maybe hear me the first time around, or isn't showing signs of being as engaged as they normally would do, and to make assumptions on their own right. So when we talk about reasonable adjustments in that case, Susie, what are the sorts of things that employers need to be thinking about on this topic?
It's absolutely right to have that open conversation with the employee, because hearing loss, there are lots of different reasons for hearing loss. There are different hearing technologies people might wear. They might require different adjustments depending on what their condition is. But generally speaking, there are some things that employers can do to help any employee who's got a hearing loss. So the first really important thing I think to say is that having a hearing loss can cause listening fatigue. Because you are at a disadvantage with your hearing, you spend a lot more of your energy focusing on what people are saying and trying to understand, trying to hear, and your brain is working overtime. If you miss a sound or a particular word, you're trying to fill those gaps. So it can be a lot more draining. So employers should think really carefully about kind of the amount of interaction. So one long meeting after another can be very problematic for anybody, but particularly with a hearing loss, it can cause some listening fatigue. That said, captions within meetings, just making sure that they're accessible, they're used by everybody. So that can really help with an employee's ability to participate in the meeting. Being aware, particularly in face-to-face or in online meetings, being aware that the person with the hearing loss is going to probably require the ability to see your face, because I mean, everybody to some extent uses lip reading to aid the communication, the reading of the communication. But people with a hearing loss will obviously do it probably to a greater extent. So when presenting, for example, in a face-to-face meeting or an online meeting, when presenting, if for any reason the presenter's face is not clearly visible to the person with hearing loss, then that can cause problems with how much they are getting. So having an awareness of, within meetings, if it's a face-to-face meeting, how people are set up, perhaps asking the employee, where would you prefer to sit? Where would be the best place? And if you've got in your office a wall of windows, don't sit with your back to the windows, because that makes accessing your lip pattern really difficult. So allowing the employee the choice of perhaps where to sit in that meeting to provide them with the best possible access to the sound would be great. Within online meetings, it can be difficult if somebody is presenting and then they end up being very, very small on the screen. So again, making sure that the employee has captions, that they're comfortable reading the captions at the same time as participating in the meeting. Those kinds of things are really important. Deaf awareness training. As I say, the word deaf here encompasses all hearing loss. And I mean, I think whether you know that you have an employee with a hearing loss or not, deaf awareness training is something that can benefit not just colleagues and employees, but it can also benefit how your staff communicate with people outside of your organisation. So it can only improve on people's communication with clients and things like that, because you're almost certainly not going to know whether the person that you're talking to from another company or a client has a hearing loss. So having that deaf awareness training given to all of your staff is it's beneficial in so many more ways than perhaps I think employers realise.
I'm with you on that. And knowledge is power in many respects as well. And one shouldn't wait until it's too late, as it were, or when things are going on. It's better to be prepared. So I'm certainly with you on that. And I touched on one point earlier, and I want to bring that to this point now as we're looking to close this video, and that's about communication and encouraging communication. Much like many conditions or illnesses, I appreciate being deaf may be one of those conditions where one may feel that they are unable to talk about such a subject to their employer. But speak to the necessity, one of opening up, as it were, and engaging in proactive and progressive communication and the benefits of that.
It is so important to allow your employees to feel that they can have those kinds of discussions. As I said earlier, there is still this stigma around having a hearing loss. And particularly for an employee, they may be feeling that their employer won't understand, that the reasonable adjustments won't be able to be made, or even perhaps if they are approaching perhaps an older age, perhaps getting a little bit closer to retirement, they may be feeling that they don't want to tell their employer, because their employer may then feel, well, clearly this person is getting maybe a bit too old to do the job, and it creates some kind of an uncomfortableness for the employee. So they're not going to want to disclose. And because there is this stigma, it's just really important that employers start the discussion. And as I say, having deaf awareness training that is just not even because you know that an employee has a hearing loss, but by saying we're going to have deaf awareness training, it's really important. You are showing your employees that it's something that you've thought about and that you care about it, and that you want your company to have that kind of ethos where you are trying to treat people equitably without knowing if they've got hearing loss or not. And that just might make employees feel much more comfortable and willing to therefore enter into those discussions and say, oh, actually, that was really interesting training. By the way, I do have a hearing loss and I wear hearing aids. I mean, these days, I have traditional behind the ear hearing aids, but these days you can get really, really small ones that are so discreet that you wouldn't know, and particularly if you've got slightly longer hair and you cover them, you might never know. So it's just really important that the employer starts those conversations. You want to make your employees feel comfortable and confident that by disclosing that they have any kind of hearing loss or hearing issues, that the company is going to support them and that they're not going to feel ostracized or that they made the wrong decision.
I hear you. Thank you for sharing those really, really helpful nuggets there, Susie. So as we close, Susie, how can people get in touch with you?
So I have a website. It's at www.oxfordbsl.com, or they can email me. They can find me on LinkedIn. They can email me on info@oxfordbsl.com, or as I say, find me on LinkedIn. And yeah, I'm really happy to enter into discussions for deaf awareness training, or just talking about how perhaps you can start those open conversations with people.
Cool. Thank you, Susie. For those of you who might be needing any employment law related advice, then you can find our website at www.magaralaw.co.uk and our number 01869325883. Or indeed, send me an email at roy@magaralaw.co.uk. Thank you, Susie, and thank you everyone for watching. Goodbye.